Okay, so I come from a very culturally varied background, and I thought it would be interesting to look at cultural stereotyping and under what circumstances it is ethically acceptable for us to culturally stereotype. I've been raised according to the Sikh faith. My real-life situation is somewhat personal to me, as I've been raised hearing my father's stories of racism. And so I extracted the knowledge claim, and I noticed that many Sikh people have felt a rise in hostility since the 9/11 attacks, and they felt cultural stereotype towards them, perhaps because of their appearance and the turbans they've worn. After 9/11, an image of bin Laden was put out, and they saw the turban, and obviously Sikh people wear the turban. And because of this, people began to think and state them for Muslims. And the area of knowledge I chose to look at first is ethics, because it deals with human thoughts and actions. And I thought it was helpful and relevant because it attempts to understand moral choices. And secondly, I chose to look at the human sciences because, again, it was relevant to politics and to governments. So I looked at who are the Sikhs. They originate from northern India. There's 27 million Sikhs worldwide. It's based on the saint soldier concept. Again, the teachings of the 10 gurus, truth, unity, service and equality, and the turbans that I mentioned before are worn to cover the uncut hair, which is kept to the belief that the body should remain in its natural form. I then looked at what exactly cultural stereotyping is. So, stereotyping, according to the Oxford Dictionary, the definition is a widely held but fixed and oversimplified image or idea of a particular type of person or thing. So cultural stereotyping are judgments on the 5 things over here. It's an oversimplified system where people group races, religions, and religions together make judgments and generalizations about their appearance, status, actions, beliefs, and cultural norms. I then looked at specific examples of the cultural stereotyping since 9/11. So the first was 4 days after 9/11, when Balbir Singh Sodhi was killed outside his gas station in Arizona. And the gunman later said he mistook him for a Muslim and killed him in retaliation for the attacks. And the gunman was later sentenced to death and charged with first-degree murder. The second I looked at was a US Army veteran who was assaulted by a policeman in 2007 in Illinois, and he was physically assaulted in front of his wife and child, and the policeman yelled racist and anti-immigrant statements. The third one was less than a few months ago in 2015, again in Illinois, when a teenager yelled bin Laden and terrorist at a Sikh man, and mistaking him again for a Muslim and a terrorist, and he was charged with a hate crime. And the fact that all of these things the person was mistook for a Muslim showed me that it was cultural stereotyping, because there was no imminent threat to the attacker in these situations. There have been over 1,000 reported incidences against Sikhs since 9/11, and all have included some sort of racial slur. So this led me to a knowledge issue, thinking about whether there was ever a situation in which cultural stereotyping was acceptable. So when national security is threatened, it may be ethically acceptable for us to culturally stereotype. And I looked at this in terms of an example. So if there has been an attack on US soil and the government is looking for a suspect, and they put out the following description to the media, to the public, and take a moment to look at this description, and I'm going to show you 5 images, and you can keep it to yourself about which one you think would be a terrorist. And in this situation, do you think it would be ethically acceptable for us to culturally stereotype? And so these are the images, and which one do you think would be the terrorist? And our views are all going to be subjective to us because of our experiences and our conditioning and our beliefs. And one of these is actually a terrorist, and it is this one here. So I felt the need to look at this from subjective and objective viewpoints. So firstly, an objective viewpoint is unbiased and factual. It states what happens. So an example is Jacob looked at the man who carried the plate with meat. It's very factual, and there's no emotion based in it. The subjective viewpoint is personal and specific to someone or a group of people. It often results from beliefs or belief systems and generalizations. Jacob looked and felt anger towards the man who carried the plate with meat. So in terms of the national security and the knowledge issue, it's a subjective viewpoint, as governments protect their own interests and their own people. So as I said, subjective views are often a result of conditioning and beliefs. The first way of knowing I'm going to look at to assess the knowledge issue is reason. So reason is used to make a decision. It often occurs instinctively as a result of previous experience and conditioning. However, it's possible to train ourselves to reason consciously, meaning that one thinks about decisions he or she is making and is able to have more control over them. And this has been termed intellectual enlightenment. And it's when we're aware of every choice we make, and the extent to which we're able to do this determines how rational we are as a person. I then looked at inductive and deductive reasoning. So inductive reasoning is when one puts extra information in to influence one's opinions. This is done by governments fairly often in terms of the knowledge issue to influence one's opinions, and can be done to culturally stereotype people. Deductive reasoning is when one leaves out information to influence one's opinions. I looked at logical fallacies as well. It's an idea that uses flawed reasoning to arrive at a conclusion, and these may occur accidentally or deliberately in order to convince people that there is truth in what one is saying. An example of this that I've spoken about is generalizations. So for example, all people in Africa are starving, or all Muslims are terrorists. And generalizations as well are also often results of beliefs and conditionings. So some people are going to look at things objectively and some will look at it subjectively. In terms of reason, people will have their own experiences, and that is subjective. I thought reason was closely linked to emotion. That's my next way of knowing. Emotion is defined by the Oxford Dictionary on this slide as a natural instinctive state of mind deriving from one's circumstances, mood, or relationship with others. And I thought this was linked very closely to reasoning, as it's also unconscious. For example, if one lost a loved one in the 9/11 attacks, then they are going to be emotionally inclined when reasoning and making judgments, and are therefore more likely to culturally stereotype. I looked then at nationalism as an emotionally based belief that humans should be defined by the political entity in which they live. So I, even as a British citizen, live within the US, and I should be defined by the fact that I live within the US, and my beliefs should be based around that. Propaganda is a communication of ideas in a way that will emotionally persuade people towards a particular ideological or political cause. And I thought this was quite prominent because it's often used by governments to persuade people to think the same as they do, as seen with Hitler during his rise to power and his prosecution of the Jewish people. And it links to emotional appeal and logical fallacies as well. So therefore, emotion is closely linked to reason, and reason is a way of knowing. To look at the knowledge issue at hand is subjective. It's a matter of opinion and is affected by emotion. The next way of knowing I'm going to look at is sense perception, as it's the very thing that allows, I think, for cultural stereotyping. I looked first at this quote: "Things have not only to be seen to be believed, but also have to be believed to be seen." I thought it was very interesting because it looks at belief and links it to sight, and links it to sense perception as well. It looks at shared knowledge, I think, and it comes from the influence we get from the media. I think shared knowledge is it's shared through the media. Understanding is gained through the five senses. As I said, it links it through the media. And the five senses I listed on the slide. I thought it was important to look at the reliability of our physical senses. Our sight, for example, shows that we are not capable of dealing with objects at a long distance. The retina itself is almost colorblind, showing that the optical abilities of humans is poor without the assistance of the brain. So is sense perception reliable if our physical senses aren't reliable? From a mental view, it is closely linked to language through media. Language choices are very carefully selected to make people feel certain things. Media and technology is everywhere now, and people are conditioned to think certain things through sense perception because they're seeing things on social networks and on their phones, hearing things on television and on the news, in music and movies. Therefore, language is closely linked to sense perception. Sense perception is the very thing that makes it possible for one to culturally stereotype. If we didn't see and hear things, we wouldn't be able to know what things hear, sound and look like, and therefore we wouldn't be able to stereotype. Much like reason and emotion, sense perception is subjective to the individual. In the case of my knowledge question, subjective to groups of individuals or countries. And this led me to my conclusions about my knowledge issue and therefore my knowledge question. Firstly, when national security is threatened, it may be ethically acceptable for us to culturally stereotype. This is because the lives of many have already been lost or may potentially be at risk. Therefore, as shown before, cultural stereotyping in this case is serving a greater purpose. However, to counterclaim this, when national security is threatened is subjective and based on emotion and reason. The people making this decision may not be intellectually enlightened, therefore making it harder to reason when it is ethically acceptable. To answer the overall knowledge question, it is not ethically acceptable to culturally stereotype without just reason or imminent threat. Because if we were to do so, we would just be making gross generalizations and grouping people. However, to counterclaim this, just reason and imminent threat is subjective and opinion-based and belief-based. And therefore, reason and emotion are the ways just reason and imminent threats are found. They are subjective and may be harming a few yet saving many, therefore making it difficult to find some solution which is in fact ethical. I'd like to pose on the fact that we are all humans regardless of how we looked, as depicted by the 5 students from this school. I think this is very well captured by Albert Schweitzer's quote, "Ethics is nothing else than reverence for life."